Hello, my name is Arun Apte. I'm the CEO of CloudLIMS, and today's talk is about QA/QC testing in your in-house cannabis extraction lab. So what we have found is we've been getting a number of customers who are cannabis extraction labs, and what they're doing is instead of just sending out all of their samples to third-party analytical testing labs, they are setting up in-house testing labs in order to be able to get real-time results to optimize their extraction process. So I want to talk about, in this talk, I'm going to be covering all of the reasons why a cannabis extraction lab would want to do their in-house testing, and then the benefits that a LIMS gives to those testing labs in order to be able to optimize all of their processes, particularly using trend analysis. So first, let's go over a little bit of background of what is the cannabis extraction process. The cannabis extraction process has 5 main steps. The first step is collecting and milling. This is basically taking your beginning product, which I'll just generically call cannabis because it could be hemp, but that's just cannabis with a low THC, and grinding it down to the optimal particle size for the extraction process. There's all kinds of equipment available from this. I've seen high-end instruments, which are professional milling machines with automatic loading apparatus and hoppers, and these are for very large production facilities, to small production facilities where it might be a technician using a Vitamix, like I've got on my kitchen counter from Costco, to grind the cannabis down to a smaller particle size. The second step is the extraction process itself. The extraction process can use a number of different solvents. There's butane, there's CO2, which I'm a big fan of. That's been increasing in popularity. After the extraction process, then, and this could actually be done either before or after extraction, there's activation and decarboxylation. So the reason for decarboxylation is the active ingredient, the active cannabinoid in cannabis is THCA, but THCA is not actually psychoactive. So traditionally, back in the day before legalization, when people used to smoke cannabis, the actual smoking process, the heat from that process, would cause the THCA to convert to THC. This is the decarboxylation that's caused by a slow heating process. Then we introduced vape pens. The vape pens had the same advantage because since they were heated, they self-decarboxylate. But once edibles, topicals, and tinctures came on the market, then the extraction labs that were making these products need to do the decarboxylation step themselves. If you skip the decarboxylation, then the end product has THCA, which is not psychoactive. The fourth step is winterization. As is implied in the term winter comes because it's done at low temperature, and it's basically a precipitation of unwanted lipids from the extracted product. There's a whole bunch of lipids which you do this precipitation step to remove. If you don't do the winterization step, what happens is, and it can be skipped depending on what the final consumption method will be, but if you're putting it into a vape pen, those lipids will actually leave a residue that burns. So you'll end up with very unhappy consumers who load your product into their vape pens and end up with a black burnt gunk at the end and have to continuously clean their pens. So the winterization process removes all these unwanted lipids. In edible products, it's kind of a matter of opinion whether you want to remove them or not. It depends basically whether you want the flavor of the cannabis to remain, or you only want the flavor of the edible. So I've seen products, chocolates, for example, some of which have had the winterization step done, which taste just like the chocolate. You can't actually taste the cannabis, and other products which have not had the winterization, and then they taste like cannabis. So it really depends on the end product you're going for. The fifth step is the third-party testing, although I would argue that before you do that third-party testing, and in fact, at each step through the process, you should be doing in-house testing. So the in-house testing you'd want to be doing when you first receive the product before milling, because that's how you ensure that the grower is providing you with a consistent starting material that is to the spec. So for example, if you paid for a certain THC percentage, you want to ensure that the product that is delivered with representative sampling is at that THC level, and not just from one little part of the batch, but throughout the whole batch. And you want to do it for every batch that's delivered, because there's high variability from growers and what they can produce for you. So once you know what you have to start with, then you can do the extraction step. After the extraction step, you'll want to do another in-house. Decarboxylation, you can do real-time testing to see when the process is complete, and after winterization before sending it out. By testing at each one of these steps, or after each one of these steps, you're able to optimize using GMP your entire process so that your end products have reproducible cannabinoid and terpene profiles, and you're able to optimize the amount of time taken for each batch step so you can run as many batches as possible with your existing set of instruments. Now let's talk a little bit about the forms of cannabis extracts. There's crumble, batter, butter, shatter, distillate, crystalline, dry sift, rosin, and bubble hash. Most of these forms, the crumble, batter, shatter, crystalline, dry sift, rosin, and bubble hash, are end products that can be sold directly to consumers and are usually used in vape pens. They can be added for smoking. Distillate is generally then used as an ingredient to make some other product. It could be something as simple as a vape cartridge, or it could be something more involved, like turning it into a tincture or turning it into an edible. So as we were discussing before with the decarboxylation step, decarboxylation is necessary for the distillate for any application except for the vape pen application. What are the methods of consuming extracts? Well, there's edibles, capsules, tinctures, vaping, dabbing, and topicals. For all of these edible versions, which would be the edibles, the capsules, the tinctures, and the topicals, none of which involve a heating process, for those you would do the decarboxylation. For vaping and dabbing, it wouldn't be necessary. So now I want to go on to the first reason why a cannabis extraction lab would want to set up an in-house testing facility. So one of our customers who came to us because they actually encountered a problem was a Colorado-based CBD product manufacturer. So they receive hemp, they do a CBD extraction, and then they actually make a CBD topical product. They do use a pretty basic workflow: CO2 extraction, followed by decarboxylation, then purification, terpene enrichment for the particular terpenes that they're advertising for, which in this case is for pain relief, and then quality control, which previously they had been doing only by sending out to a third-party testing lab. And that's when they encountered the problem. The problem was test failure. So they went through this whole expensive process, starting with a fairly large batch, and they were getting a high failure rate. We checked in with the state, which actually publishes this data, and found that in a given time period, 20% of the products, the extraction products, were failing in the third-party testing. So this represents a huge financial loss for the extraction companies, which then either had to destroy the product or put them back through re-extraction, which is very expensive and leads to lower yields. So with failure rates this high, you want to do everything you can to minimize the failure rates, which is exactly what this CBD extractor did. If your final product is rejected by the third-party testing lab at the end, you have big costs associated with it. You have to either do a re-extraction or throw away your product. You have a delay in the product delivery, so that if you had dispensaries who were waiting for your product, they are going to be very unhappy customers, and you have the resulting loss of customers and revenues. Now, this is if it fails. Even if your product passes the test, you still have many disadvantages by only doing the third-party testing. The first one is time delays. If you were having tests done for different aspects of the extraction process. Say you want the initial product to be tested to ensure that the potency that you're paying for is the potency you're actually getting. That if you have an organic product and it should be pesticide free, that it actually is pesticide free. If you send that out to a third-party testing lab, on average, depending on your state and the backlog, it can take several days. So this will slow down your whole process, right? You have to store all the materials while you wait the test results. If you start the extraction, then you may end up needing to throw away those materials if you find that the product delivered to you was not the product you had paid for. There's a higher cost for all of these tests. Lab backlog is basically another form of time delay. This is that you are operating based upon the queue that is in that third-party testing lab, and there are crunch times. So, for example, when Oregon first did recreationally legalize cannabis during their rollout, the state, they had a very bad rollout, but the state only approved 2 recreational testing labs in the entire state. So naturally, there was a tremendous backlog, and the extractors were stuck because it would take months for them with only 2 labs in the state to get the third-party approval. And then they had that 20% chance of a rejection. So you're at the mercy of the third-party lab if you only rely on third-party labs for your testing. And finally, the GMP intermediate step testing. When we're going over the extraction process and we talked about the 5 steps, you want to do your own intermediate tests through each of those 5 steps, the GMP intermediate testing steps. And for this, you need an in-house testing lab. So, benefit number 1 for setting up your own in-house testing lab is you save all of this re-extraction costs and you get your results faster. Now let's go on to the second reason why you would want an in-house testing lab, and that is formulation. So we are now in a huge, increasingly sophisticated consumer market. So I like to use the analogy of wine. If you walk into the supermarket, you won't just see a bottle of wine for sale that's labeled wine. It will say, this is a red wine that is done with this type of grape from this particular region of the world by this winery. It has these fruity undertones and other things. You walk into a high-end cannabis dispensary now, you will see very, very similar product offerings. Cannabis has become a premium product, or at least at the upper end of the market, which you want to distinguish. And the way you distinguish it is with your formulation. You say, whatever it is you're looking for, if you are looking for a product that is good for sleep, we have a formulation, an optimization of the cannabinoids and the terpenes that are good for sleep. If you are looking for something that is stimulating and uplifting, we have something for that. On the medical side, if you are looking for anti-anxiety, there are specific formulations for that. Now, how does an extraction lab create these formulations? They do it through in-house testing. So for your formulation, you want to set the dosage. The dosage is the dosage both of the THC, which is generally called potency, but it's also the whole cannabinoid profile. Some of the cannabinoids are better for particular medicinal effects than others. You also need to ensure your label accuracy. If you are advertising, we have created this particular formulation for anti-anxiety, you want to ensure that your cannabinoid and terpene profile supports that. A lot of cannabis companies are now going organic. So they source organically grown hemp or cannabis, and then they create a product. But you need to make sure that your claim is validated by testing the product received in your extraction lab for those pesticides. And the easiest, fastest way to do that is with in-house testing. And finally, adverse patient reactions. Heavy metals, pesticides, there are all mycotoxins. There's all kinds of problems that can be associated with patient health, and all of those will bring liability to the manufacturer if you are not testing properly to ensure that your product doesn't have any of those. Now I want to talk specifically about a terpene, my favorite terpene, linalool. Linalool is a terpene that's found naturally occurring in lavender, it's produced in rosemary, and it just smells great. If I smell a cannabis product, I can detect the linalool. It has anti-anxiety properties. It leads to mental alertness. In animal models, it's been shown to be highly effective as an antidepressant. So when I go to a dispensary, generally a good dispensary, I will say, which of your products are high in linalool? And from a good concentration manufacturer, I can actually see the profile of terpenes and cannabinoids and what their formulation is for that particular product. So if you want to create a brand of extract that targets specific conditions and is at the high end of the market, you need to be very careful with your formulation. Which brings us to the second benefit. By having in-house testing, you are able to control the complete cannabinoid profile of your final product. You can optimize a cannabinoid profile. You can get consistent dosage and formulation. You can control for the onset of action because depending on what is in the final product, it has different absorption rates. You get metabolic predictability and improved safety and effectiveness. So we've now gone over two benefits to having an in-house testing lab. The first one being so that you don't fail in your third-party testing. The second being so that you can do formulation and reformulation in-house to create a wide range of products, each one of which has a specific targeted formulation. The third reason, GMP, good manufacturing practices. All cannabis extraction labs should be following GMP. It's done in the pharmaceutical industry, it's done in the food production industry, and cannabis is very similar. Whether you're growing or extracting, do it the right way. How do you follow GMP in the cannabis industry? Well, it starts with your SOPs. You need to have an SOP for each step of your manufacturing process. This includes the extraction side as well as the testing side. You want your SOPs to be optimized and you want all of your people to be trained and to follow them. Prompt and accurate documentation of the work for compliance and traceability. Every single sample that you run needs to be traceable back to a QC sample, a spike, a duplicate, a blank, whatever it is. That's part of 17025 compliance on the third-party analytical testing side. It's part of GMP compliance on the extraction side. You need to maintain your facility and all your equipment. This means calibration and maintenance as per the schedule. And it gets even more complicated as we go in later because a lot of the equipment, complicated instruments such as LCMS, will have multiple subcomponents, each one of which has their own schedule for calibration and maintenance. And finally, define, develop, and prove the job competency. This is the training of your staff. All of your staff need to be trained for each thing they're going to be doing in the lab, both on the testing side and the extraction side. So this brings us to our third and final benefit for setting up your own in-house testing lab, which is you can get higher yields because using trend analysis, you can optimize the amount of time you spend in the extraction process, in the decarboxylation process, and in the winterization process. You get better product consistency by controlling at each step that you're getting the same potency, the same cannabinoid profile. Your final end product will also be consistent, and reduce liability since you're able to test right from the beginning for heavy metals, pesticides, mycotoxins, etc. So benefits of an in-house testing lab. The benefits are at each step of your process. In your extraction step, right from the beginning, before you start the extraction, you're able to test the true potency of the flower, which has been given to you by the grower. You're able to look at your extraction efficiency, which is average efficiencies can be as low as 30%. So anything you can do to increase that efficiency will make your product far more cost competitive. So you're able to determine your extraction efficiency and keep working on improving it. You can get the potency of your crude oil right after it comes out of the extraction before the next step, so you can see at which step in your process are you losing your THC, are you losing your product, so that you can keep optimizing for that. Post-processing. The main post-processing step is the decarboxylation. You want to determine in real time, because it's quite variable, when to stop the decarboxylation process. To do that, you need to measure how much of the product is decarboxylated in real time. And that can only be done with an in-house testing lab. There's no time to send it out to a third-party lab. And finally, the formulation. This is not the formulation that we were discussing before, which is creating new products. This is once you have a formula, with every batch, you want that batch to consistently follow your formulation. If there is a variability in the product given to you to start with, they have a slightly different cannabinoid profile, slightly different potency, you can adjust for that in the extraction process so that your end product meets your formulation, even though there was variability with your starting product or something may have gone wrong in one of the steps of your extraction process. To do that, you need an in-house testing lab that will tell you as you do it, oh, look, after this step, we had a lower potency than we expected. So now in the following step, we're going to have to use higher concentrations in order to bring the potency back up. So it helps you with your final formulation, keeping it consistent. So I hope by now I've convinced you that in your cannabis extraction lab, it's very important to have an in-house testing lab, because that's the only way you're going to be able to avoid third-party testing, do your formulation, and follow GMP. So now let's talk about LIMS and how a LIMS will help you with all of that. The LIMS can help you in a whole bunch of ways. It can ensure the quality of the cannabis sample. So basically, there is a whole SOP for how you should be preparing the sample for any type of test you're going to do for it. Those SOPs are all contained within the LIMS. It does the tracking of the maintenance and calibration of the testing equipment, as well as the extraction equipment. It helps you with the documentation, the record keeping for all the laboratory personnel. And finally, we went through the list of the GMP requirements. It helps you follow all of the GMP requirements. Equipment, instrument calibration, and maintenance. You've got a lot of instruments. You have instruments for your calibration. You have instruments for your testing. Both sets of equipment need to be calibrated and maintained. Here we can see an Agilent HPLC. This Agilent HPLC has a calibration date, which is in December, a next calibration date in September, and 5 days before the next calibration date, the LIMS will automatically send a reminder, an email reminder as well as in-app, letting the lab manager know that the instrument needs to be calibrated. In addition to that, and this is the added layer of complexity, this instrument has 3 subcomponents, which you can see listed on the right. Every one of those subcomponents has its own calibration and maintenance schedule. So if you were doing this manually, you would have a booklet of instrument and calibration with no alerts. So it's much better to do this in the LIMS so that you're actually getting alerts and you know ahead of time when an instrument needs to be calibrated and maintained, so you have plenty of time to call a technician in. Testing and calibration methods. So you now have your instruments tested and calibrated, but in order to recalibrate them when the alarm goes off, you need to have an SOP for how your test and calibration method should be done. These are generally provided to you by the instrument manufacturer. The challenge is, because this is a new industry, the instrument manufacturers keep updating the test, calibration, and SOPs associated with any instrument. When they issue you a new one, you need to ensure that every technician gets retrained on it and only the latest calibration and testing SOP comes up. So the LIMS will do all that for you. You can see here that we had a particular version, and then we replaced that version with the latest version. The LIMS will only have the latest version comes up so that when the technician comes in to do the calibration, the technician is following the latest calibration method. Associated instruments, testing the quality of results. This is about the traceability. So this is absolutely essential for 17025 compliance in a third-party testing lab, but it is useful in an in-house testing lab. What it means is that if there is liability, if there is a question, well, how do we know that the instrument, that the test result that you gave was done on an instrument that was properly maintained and calibrated, not today, but at the time the test was done? So you need an association between the calibration date and the date on which the test was done. The LIMS will track all of that. The LIMS will say, here you can see with our traceability that the particular test was done on such and such date. Here was the previous calibration. Here was the SOP that was followed for that calibration. So you have a completely traceable record showing that your instrument was calibrated and maintained. Manage documents with LIMS. This is all of your SOPs. So the second thing that would come up in that same liability question is, when the test was done, was the correct SOP followed? This will show it to you. Only the latest SOP was available, and the SOP that was used for any particular test is tracked. This is useful in the case of a recall of a test method. Instrument manufacturers, this doesn't happen often, but they can say there was something wrong with the SOP we issued, and the test results need to be invalidated. Instead of needing to invalidate all of your tests, with the LIMS, it'll tell you only these tests were done using this SOP, so these are the only tests we need to redo. Manage staff and training. You have a whole bunch of staff, and they all need to be trained for each step of your extraction process and each step of your testing process. So here you can see two different training courses: ion exchange chromatography and paper chromatography. And in the ion exchange chromatography, we had 5 students. Some did well, some not so well. So these are made-up names, but with our made-up list of names, Maxim Gilbert, he did well. Sonia Fernandez, she did well. Christina Paul, not so well. Tim Yan, not so well. They were not found to be competent. So the results of this training course are then reflected in the drop-down when you go to assign staff to conduct a test. In the drop-down, only the names of those staff who have been found to be competent for that particular test would appear. So that way, as part of 17025 and part of GMP, you can say, well, my extraction is only being done by laboratory technicians who are found to be competent and properly trained for that particular process. Quality control samples. So we touched on briefly before, anytime you do a test, you need to have traceability back to a QC sample, a blank, a duplicate. So you need to be able to show, I ran 10 samples, then I ran a QC sample, so we know that the result is accurate because the result for that QC sample was accurate. And finally, trend analysis. This is where I think that a LIMS has the maximum benefit for an extraction lab. You are able to keep all of your data for all of the tests, and this is especially useful if you've been doing those in-process steps, so that you know the initial product, you know what was your potency after doing the initial extraction, you know the decarboxylation time, and you know what was your potency after winterization step. So with trend analysis, you are able to track the variability at each stage from batch to batch. And hopefully over time, you will make the variability from batch keep decreasing so that it's less and less and less. By doing this, you can optimize for 2 things. You can optimize for your yield, so that, let's say you're running an extraction. You can run an extraction forever, and you'll keep getting more and more of the product out. But it's a diminishing return. So at some point, it is of greater benefit for you to stop the process, to throw away that starting material and put in a new batch and start your second batch. You'll only know what that time is by doing trend analysis. With trend analysis, you get to optimize the timing for your entire extraction process. So this is where a LIMS and an in-house testing lab are extremely important, which is for the optimization of your entire process. With trend analysis, you can optimize the time for decarboxylation, for winterization, and for extraction. Trend analysis. You get the optimization of your extraction process. You can visualize your GMP. You can ensure that you're getting a consistent CBD and terpene profile. And it provides you with a detailed overview of the performance of your laboratory, enabling you to compare your yields to other extraction labs so that the lab manager can then take corrective actions. So using a LIMS gives you more accurate results, greater productivity, a higher quality and more consistent product, and lower costs since you've been able to optimize your yields as well as throughput. And finally, you have a happy extraction lab. You have a reduction in compliance failures, you have higher throughput and higher yields, you have a wide product range since you're able to create new formulations using your in-house testing lab, and you have a reputation for consistency of the final product among customers. So I hope that this has been useful to you and that you've learned the reasons why extraction labs, in my opinion, should all have in-house testing and how LIMS can help you. Thank you very much.